Now, cast your minds back to the 1813 quote from the minister that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And this was obviously very far from being the view either in government or chemical circles a decade before this quote. Payan was in fact describing a winner's history in which the victory, both commercial and chemical, of beet sugar over grape and other surrogates looked self-evident. Moreover, a particular mythology which survives today on the internet, as in scholarly histories, grew up around beet sugar manufacture. This mythology, like the Saint-Dalfour mythology, bears close scrutiny, for not only is it the prevailing account which you'll find reproduced absolutely everywhere, but it served to efface accounts of sugar, of scientific experimentation on and industrial scale production of alternative sugar substitutes. And that effacement has actually occurred in such a way that knowledge of these is effaced almost completely from the historical record, which is the sleight of hand that makes it possible for a company like Saint-Dalfour in the present day to write as if grape syrup were a traditional, artisanal, non-scientific and anti-industrial. Whereas, as we've seen, it was a scientific novelty, fiercely resisted by consumers, strongly supported by the Napoleonic centralizing state, and in fact preceded beet sugar as one of the first industrially produced foodstuffs. So let me end by giving you the accepted historical version of the victory of beet sugar production in France. Almost every account begins with the date of January the 2nd, 1812. Oh, I've missed this out. In fact, this is a map showing the sites where beet sugar was being produced. Actually, I'll come back to that. So, here we are. The date of January the 2nd, 1812 was the day when Napoleon Bonaparte toured the beet sugar factory of Benjamin Delessert. On that day, thus an anecdote repeated ad nauseum since the early 19th century, 2 loaves of the first beet sugar produced in France were presented to the emperor by his Minister of the Interior. They'd been manufactured by Benjamin Delessert, scion of a Genevan merchant and banking family, with a manufactory at Passy on the Seine, just outside Paris. When the senator showed Delessert's product to him, the emperor promptly paid an unannounced visit to the Passy factory. Its owner, arriving back in Passy somewhat later, found the imperial guard barring his factory doors, and he had to convince them of his own identity before he was allowed to gain admission. Napoleon was supposedly so impressed by the factory that he removed a medal from his own buttonhole and pinned it upon Delessert's chest then and there. And the proprietor later received a cash prize and was made a baron of the empire. And this supposedly, and there's a whole iconography connected with this on the internet. I think this is probably the closest one can get to an original, but I haven't been able to find the original at all. But anyway, this constantly kind of reiterates this scene in which Napoleon is present at Passy and bestows this supposedly wonderful honour upon Delessert. But in reality, this tale of the apotheosis of beet sugar in France conceals 2 vital facts. Firstly, by January 1812, an empire-wide beet sugar production programme had already been in place in France for almost a year. And I just want to go back here. Oops, blast. I'll go back to that map. Because this is actually a map showing the sites which in early 1811 were already producing beet sugar. It documents the département in the empire in which there was one or more manufactory of beet sugar. The shaded red areas constitute the département in which there was beet sugar production already going on in 1811. You can see that it's probably around a third of the département in the empire. This is a kind of formulaic map that they use for administrative purposes in the Ministry of the Interior. So, and now this came about because a pharmacist, Drapier, had suggested to the Minister of the Interior a plan for increasing beet production and setting up schools for beet sugar manufacture nationwide, and these were implemented in a decree of March 1811. Drapier had already presented samples of crystalline beet sugar to the Minister of the Interior in January or February of 1811. And secondly, as we know, by 1813, the minister still viewed all existing beet sugar in commerce as of poor quality, which includes, of course, the Delessert samples. And I'll just go back to this for a moment to show you that indeed this stuff was being sold as if it were ordinary cane sugar in sugar loaves. So what was really going on in this much recounted episode? Well, Napoleon and his ministers had had an interest in Delessert for quite some time. And I mean that in the slightly sinister way in which it sounds. Delessert's father had been a very wealthy merchant and banker, and he'd purchased 2 adjacent estates in Passy in 1777. And here, perched on the slopes above the river Seine, the family had recreated Switzerland in miniature, a chalet, a dairy, and maps of the main locations of the 13 Swiss cantons. Guests of the family could stroll through the gardens to the sound of alpenhorns. The Delessert family property was a microcosm of the model state, and the family's contacts with Rousseau and Franklin conferred moral legitimacy upon Delessert's post-revolutionary industrial and philanthropic activities. As a young man, he'd made waves in 1790s Paris by founding urban soup kitchens. He would die in 1847 after a distinguished career as a statesman, capitalist and financier. He was thus quite independent of Napoleonic patronage in both scientific and political terms. Delessert sat on the Paris Hospital Council, and his interest in sugar was probably initiated by his medical and philanthropic connections. The factory, initially founded in 1801 as a cane sugar refinery, was still operational in 1836, served by the first suspension bridge in France. The proximity of the Seine and of the vast Parisian market made sugar manufacture profitable. It was also a model site for new industrial labour relations of a sort more familiar from the British context. Even in 1847, it was still attracting praise for the disciplinary control exercised over the workers and for replacing the customary 5-day working week with a 6-day one. Tightly controlled social management on a local scale allowed the successful production of the very good, by means of which the emperor and his ministers sought to assure national public order. In addition, Delessert was a governor of the Banque de France, Napoleon's chief source of personal credit. So Napoleon, in effect, was in debt to Delessert, perched in his autonomous domain overlooking Paris. Lastly, and perhaps most insultingly of all, the Delessert sugar factory, rather like Willy Wonka's, was notoriously closed to all visitors, as provincial entrepreneurs seeking to inform themselves about sugar manufacturing processes found at their cost. Napoleon's manifestation in person in the Delessert factory, accompanied by an armed force, thus his activities in informing himself about the perfecting of processes, of the order of working, of discipline among the workers, as he put it, at the Passy factory, have some resemblance rather to industrial espionage, or at the very least represent a rather overtly powerful display of the emperor's ability to monitor Delessert's manufacturing enterprise, willy-nilly.